Good afternoon. My name is Gilberto Rivera. That's Gilbertrivera. And I am 73 years old. I was born and raised here in Austin, Texas. And my family is originally from the Victoria, McFadden area of Texas, which is sort of close to the coast, Sinton, Corpus Christi area. And family lore has it that we were from the coast, and we are from the coast, and that we are native Karankaans, the native people that lived on the coast that were fisher people. And so had my DNA done, and I'm 55% indigenous.
Okay. My name is Jane Rivera, Jane Rivera. I'm originally from Michigan. I moved here 42 years ago from Lansing, Michigan, to teach at Juarez Lincoln University. And when I went to report to work, unfortunately, they were padlocked. And I found out that the university had been in an accreditation battle with the Texas Education Agency and had lost. And so one of 3 Mexican-American universities in the Southwest that were accredited through Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, were all closed. And so I ended up here without a job. My first job, I was working for Southwest Educational Television for Ida Barrera, who was the mind behind Carrascolendas. And I worked with her on a program that came out on public television called Checking It Out. And one day I saw an ad in the newspaper for a person to write grant applications for the East Austin Chicano Economic Development Corporation. And I had gotten my PhD in economic anthropology, so that was absolutely up my aisle. And I applied for the job, and that's where I met my husband.
And as I said earlier, my family is native, hundreds of years to this area. We were here before there was a Texas, before there was probably a United States, because we are Karankawan, and so we are native to this area. And we lived in what was in Mexico, northern Mexico. And as we like to say, we did not cross the border, the border crossed us. And so we have lived in Austin since 1945, when my dad and mom moved from South Texas. And I shouldn't say South Texas, that implies it's from the valley, but more like Corpus, Victoria area. And they were not tenant farmers, they were sharecroppers. And they lived on a farm where, if you don't know what a sharecropping is, it's someone that lives in a farm, they work in the fields, and they worked cotton primarily. And we were cotton pickers. And when they harvested the cotton, he planted the cotton, picked the cotton, took it to the gin, had it ginned, and however many bales of cotton were produced, half of them went to the farm owner of the farm. The other half went to my dad of the profit. And unfortunately, throughout the year, my mom and dad, it's in McFadden, Texas, they had one grocery store, and it was owned by the farmer, by the owner of the farm. Then he would give them credit all year. There was only one gas station. He would give them credit all year. So at the end of the year, he'd get half of the crop, half of the profit. With the half of the crop and the profit, or the half of the profit my dad got, he had to pay for 1 year's worth of gasoline that he had to use to produce the cotton, and 1 year's worth of groceries that he had to buy in order for the family to eat. So by the time it was all said and done, they basically had no money. So they were back on credit again. So this was kind of an indentured servant kind of thing, and it was very modern day slavery, I would call it. And then they finally had enough, and they moved to Austin in 45, and I was born in 47. I come from a family of 8 children, 2 of them passed away when they were young. And I was born, in fact, maybe 4 blocks from where I live right now, from where we're sitting. I was born at home. A midwife brought me into this world. And she, as was tradition, she buried my umbilical cord and placenta and everything else in the backyard. And my mom, I've gone to a lot of places in the world. Was in Seattle at the University of Washington for 6, 7 years, and I always came back. I was in Mexico and other parts of the world, in Africa, but I always came back. And my mom said that it was because the umbilical cord pulled me back. So I thought that was a kind of a neat story. At first I was embarrassed about it, but it was kind of cool.
And Gilbert didn't mention, but one of the 2 brothers or sisters of his that passed away was his twin. He was born a twin, and his twin and he contracted polio when they were 3 months old. His twin passed away and Gilbert survived, but he spent his whole life living a normal life despite having polio. To this day, he has post-polio problems because his body has been operating only on half of the body, having good muscle control and everything. So it's not been easy.
The thing that was interesting in moving to Austin was when I began to go to school. Wound up going to the Austin Independent School District, segregated district, programs. Austin was segregated till about 1971, 72, when the federal government finally declared that Austin, actually it was 1975, declared that Austin schools were actually integrated. And I went to Go Valley Elementary, Allen Junior High, and Johnston High School. At Go Valley Elementary, I only spoke Spanish when I entered school, and I could not answer the teacher, and if I did, I would usually I would answer in Spanish, and if you spoke in Spanish, you'd get punished, and we would be sent to the principal's office and get either spanked or treated pretty viciously as a 6-year-old kid. And what they would do, if you all remember when you walk in school, elementary school, they line you up. Well, they would line us all up, but every so often there'd be another student standing there, or they'd be in the cafeteria, or they'd be in the playground when you were in recess. And if you were caught Spanish, the student guards would rat you out. And then you'd be sent to the principal's office and punished and spanked again. And so I learned very quickly that I didn't like to be punished and spanked. So for a year and a half, I didn't speak at all. And so they held me back and declared that I was
he was mentally challenged, that he couldn't speak.
Mentally challenged because I wouldn't speak. But I wouldn't speak because I knew what the consequences would be. I ultimately began to speak and wound up, graduating from high school. As a matter of fact, when I graduated from high school, and I was a little older than most of the freshmen, but I enrolled in the University of Washington through their camp program. There was a migrant worker program, and we were migrant workers also. We would go to Michigan and work the fields in the summertime. But I was enrolled as a freshman, and I was bored, and I told my counselor, I don't want to do this, I want to go to graduate school. And he said, well, you have to go through the 4-year process, Gilbert. I said, I want to go to graduate school. He said, well, good luck with that. So I checked around and found out, lo and behold, the University of Washington had a non-baccalaureate program in the Graduate School of Social Work, which is what I wanted to be, a social worker. After my freshman year, that summer I applied to grad school, and that next fall I went from a freshman to a graduate student. So I always told people I would love to go back and stick my tongue out to the teachers that said I was mentally retarded. And so this has been, for me at 73 years old, a very interesting life that having been forced, my family, to live in East Austin and my family before them, living in East Austin has always been like you live in a different city than the rest of Austin. Many times I tell people I was born and raised in East Austin, not in Austin, but in East Austin, because that's a very specific designation and a very different life that you had if you grew up in the poverty area of this city.
And Gilbert and I had, although come from different parts of the country and everything, we had some similarities in our background. He mentioned that he grew up out in the country. I grew up out in the country. And my father worked for a National Carbon Company, and he was gone most of the time. And my mother made all of our clothes out of remnant bundles that she ordered from the Sears catalog twice a year. And she raised all the food that we ate. And we learned how to plant and harvest all the fruits and vegetables, and how to raise chickens, and how to then preserve all the food. And I was very sickly. I had pneumonia, so bad I nearly died when I was 5 years old. And I was real sickly with asthma and everything, which back in the day, because I'm 75, back in those days, they had no idea that children could get asthma or that it was something that could be treated. And I remember I took an antihistamine all throughout my childhood called parabenzamine that basically keeps you high all the time. I didn't know that that's what made me have so much energy, but I guess it was. But Gilbert and I, both being sickly as children, read voraciously. And so when we got together, we were talking about the things that we've read and the things that we know, and fell in love with each other intellectually because we'd had so many similarities. And we still talk about some of the things we remember from childhood that are so similar, even though, like I said, I was born in Northern Ohio, raised there and in Northern Michigan. And it was just really interesting. Oh, and in high school, my parents divorced, and my father insisted that I had to go with him to Tennessee to punish my mother because I was much closer to her. And when I went to Tennessee, I was stunned. They let me out of high school at age 16 because they didn't have more than 3 classes that I hadn't already taken. And one of those 3 I actually taught. It was Latin 2. I was teaching Latin 1 and getting credit for Latin 2 because they didn't have anybody who spoke Latin to teach the class. And so I then went away to Michigan State the next year, which was when I was 17. And I had a rough time because I was much younger than most of the other students. I had just turned 17 when class started. And it was difficult because I didn't have the classes that I needed for the level of work that I needed to do. So I really struggled my freshman year in college. And I ended up dropping out for a year and went to live with my mother and worked full-time at a restaurant. And she said, Miha, you can live with me for this year, but I want you to save up your money and go back to college. Well, I did more than that. I saved up my money for a year and went to Mexico City to the National University of Mexico, La Universidad Autónoma de Mexico, and went there for a year, and then went back to Michigan State, and that helped me to catch up with how far behind I was. And then I was able to graduate with honors when I finally did finish.
In order to start that, we need to, today is 2021, and we're still feeling a lot of the effects of city policies that generally people discuss as the 1928 master plan, referred to as the 1928 master plan. There was issues even before then, but the 1928 master plan basically stated that people of color, African American and Mexican Americans who lived from what is now Interstate 35, west of Interstate 35, the Mexican American population generally lived around where the city council chamber is today. And there was an Ostex chili company, which is where most of them worked. And I forget the park, the name of the park that's right across the street from
Republic Park, right?
Republic Park, I think it is. It used to be called amongst the natives, the Mexican Americans, Chili Park, because most of the people that went to eat for lunch, they worked in the chili company. And so it was generally known as Little Mexico. In 1928, the city council decided that they wanted that land, and if you look at the history books, they described it in the American Statesman and city reports as the shanty town was dilapidated, dirty Mexicans and and blacks and Negroes. They called them then, and they called us Mexicans. And so they decided they wanted that land for the Central Business District. So they decreed that we should all be moved out into East Austin, which had basically no facilities, no infrastructure, no lighting, no streets, unpaved streets and so forth. So they moved us all over to this side of town, and that's how we got the tank farm. And that's how we got many other industries that are not healthy for people to live around. And so it's almost 100 years later, we're still talking about 1928. We're still talking about the tank farm. And the tank farm was just one of many industries, polluting industries, that was allowed to build around established neighborhoods.
In fact, in the 1950s, the city developed something called the Austin Industrial Development Plan, and that plan codified in the city code what areas of town were to be locations for industry. And it was all the residential neighborhoods that blacks and Mexicanos had in East Austin that were zoned industrial. And so even if your house was a residence and always had been, it was zoned industrial. So banks wouldn't loan home improvement loans to people to fix their houses. And so it encouraged the continued lack of care for homes that people wanted to care for but didn't have the money to be able to do it, and they couldn't get loans for it. And then banks acted on all of that and redlined these neighborhoods so that you had the code saying, no, it's industrial, and the bank saying, not going to loan to you. So it just basically set up the continuation of treatment of people of color's homes as so-called shantytowns. And so it was in our immediate neighborhood that the city developed what became known as, by the neighbors, as urban removal. Its official name was urban renewal from the Housing and Urban Development Commission in DC. And that was used to tear down homes in this immediate neighborhood. Gilbert and I got this house in 1983, which was rebuilt. The whole neighborhood was rebuilt after all the little homes, including the one where his family first lived when he was born, were taken away.
Yeah, this whole neighborhood that we're around is fairly new. Fairly new meaning about between 40. The newest homes are the big McMansions you see going on, but the newest was ours, which is about 35 years old. All the homes that you see here were bulldozed down, and through urban removal, and with the promise that new homes were going to be built, and the former owners of the houses where my parents lived and others lived would be first come, first choice to buy the new homes that came around. Well, that was in the late 50s, early 60s. They didn't build here till the 80s. And so by that time, all of the people, little kids like myself, were already adults and out of the house. Many of the other people wound up, because they couldn't afford anywhere to go, wound up going from homeowners to renters at publicly owned projects like Booker T, which is 2 blocks away from here. So they were lied to, and the same thing is happening today. But one of the things that really, there were many chemical plants, chemical companies, and so forth that were here Austin Independent School District had their bus depot here in East Austin, so you get all those pollutants. One of the things that began to grow in the 40s was the tank farm. They called it the tank farm because about 5 or 6 multinational corporations had, including Texaco, Sinclair, what was it, some of the other ones, I forget, were big
Standard Oil was the
Standard
biggest.
Oils, big storage tanks, and they had jet fuel and other that emitted benzene and other products constantly throughout, and that had been going on for years, and people's homes were right. Basically, the only thing that separated the tank farm from people's homes were the fence line, and so one day, one of the members of Poder, People Organized in Defense of Earth and Her Resources, was scanning the newspaper and found out that one of the oil companies this was wanting to expand its footprint by building more tanks. And this became a rallying cry for us all. And that's how the tank farm issue began.
At the time, Gilbert's grandmother, his mother's mother, lived in a little house on Alf, just down about 4 blocks from the tank farm. And we had just given her a pair of sneakers because she had told us that she just really liked the shoes that all the young people were wearing, and she thought that it would be kind of fun to have a pair because they look really comfortable and her feet always hurt. She was in her 80s at the time, and his grandmother wore her new sneakers out to the protests and stood in front of the trucks with her hand out like that saying, "No, you can't come." And she was about maybe 5 feet tall. And she was in her 80s, and she stood there. And we used to have a photograph from the Statesman that showed her, but we have not been able to find it.
The tank farm became a rallying cry for everybody throughout the city of Austin. It was one of the very first times that white environmentalists had actually come out in support of environmental issues in East Austin. And we called our struggle in East Austin as environmental racism because of the racist zoning tactics that the city used and the ability for these kind of companies to do whatever they wanted to in our side of town. My grandmother was not the only one in my family that lived on Alf Street. I had an aunt, I had some cousins. My sister lived on Munson. My parents lived on Proc Lane, and all of those are 3 different blocks. My grandmother being the one that lived closest to the tank farm. And we finally got Texas TQ
Texas Environmental Quality
to come out and do some testing and others, and found that many of the people still had wells that they used for the gardens, and some of them even for drinking. That all the wells in the area had been polluted with toxins from the tank farm, because as things the tanks overflowed, the toxins leached into the groundwater, and also into the houses, not the houses, but the yards of the houses that were, again, across the fence line, and found that there were also pockets of illnesses that were much higher than others in respect to asthma, other breathing problems, cancers, and so forth. And one of the things that they found was that many of the houses, the yards were polluted, so they had to do a major removal of tons and tons of dirt from people's houses. Many of the people, like me right now, I still have a garden, had gardens because that's the only way they could survive, because food is pretty expensive, so they planted and were eating vegetables that they had planted in polluted land, so the kids and everybody was getting sick. So one of the things that they found was that many people were more ill than others. One of those was my mother. And they picked, I think it was 4 or 5 people to send to MD Anderson Medical Center. I think it's a cancer center in Houston. And when they tested my mom, the doctors were amazed that she was so ill, and they came and asked us. She was a housewife all her life, except when we were migrant workers. They asked her, had she ever been a coal miner? They found that her lungs were as badly affected as a coal miner's because of all the toxins that she had been breathing all her life, and they lived there for 40 some odd years, and a few years later she passed away, and we attributed to the illnesses that she got from the tank farm.
And that grandmother who was there with her hand up to stop the trucks, she died a few years later of leukemia, also caused by those pollutants.
My aunt who lived there also, again, mom's, my grandmother, my aunt Lupe, my aunt Mary Alice, my mom Olivia, and a couple of other
And the daughter
kids.
Mary Alice.
And yeah, they all died within 5 years
Of cancer.
of cancers, different kinds of cancers.
And your cousin?
And my cousin
Who
recently
lived
died of cancer.
He just lived down the street.
And so we're still feeling the effects of that very destructive way the people in East Austin, the people of color specifically in East Austin, have been treated from that 1928. We're still feeling those effects almost 100 years later. And we're seeing a lot of new houses coming up, and we're seeing a lot of new apartment complexes coming up. And many of the people don't realize the struggles that we went through so they can live in what I call more luxury than we ever could. We never could. None of the people that I know that are my age, or many of their children, even their grandchildren, can live in $500,000 million homes that are being built today. And so the poor people of East Austin were dumped over here and told, you got to make it on your own. Till the early 1970s, late 60s, Proc Lane had no sewer system. We had, ¿cómo se llaman los?
Septic tanks.
Septic tanks. We had no roads except for dirt roads. We had no lights, and we were expected to pay taxes, which we did, to keep our homes, or my parents, I should say, paid. And our tax money was used to beautify the other side of town. And we lived in poverty. This was like a third world country. This was literally a third world country. But what's so beautiful about this, God damn it, is that we persevered.
And
we learned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it was beautiful. When I moved here 42 years ago, I called it East Austin because that's how all the people who lived here called it. And it was like a separate city. You crossed Interstate 35, and there were trees and little homes where you knew a lot of the people. Now, I was new, so I didn't know a lot of the people. But once Gilbert and I got together everybody knew him because he's a native, and they knew me through him. So once I had a flat tire on East 7th Street, and two guys that I'd never seen before stopped to help me. Said, "Oh, you're Gilbert's wife. We know that. Don't worry, we'll take care of you." It was like a small town. East Austin had our own dry cleaners, our own floral shop, our own grocery stores. And it was all little small businesses by the people who had been forced to live here. And so basically, they were handed lemons and they said, "Cool, lemonade," and made a beautiful community. And there was a separate black community and separate brown community, but there was some interaction between the two and respect because of the fact that they had a lot of things in common. And East Austin, to me, was beautiful because it was a bunch of people related to each other who'd been here for generations, and it was like a small town. Now it doesn't feel like that because so many people have been moved out, and most of the businesses have been forced out. And so it's no longer that complete whole community. It used to be, I worked for the Workforce Commission for almost 30 years. I would drive across Interstate 35 on my way home. And as soon as I got to this side, I go, I'm home. Now I don't feel that until I pull in the driveway.
Yeah, and a couple of the things that maybe, I know we're going back and forth and it might get confusing here, but when East Austin when we were all moved to East Austin, black and brown community, we were basically told, we're going to provide you with parks, we're going to provide you with the different amenities that are on the other side of town. What's called separate but equal. We had Parque Zaragoza, which is what it is today. It used to be known in the 1930s, 35, 36. I'm on the Travis County Historic Commission, and we just recently put up two commemorative plaques on each one of the parks. But Parque Zaragoza was known as a Mexican park. Rosewood Park was known as a Negro park. Separate but equal, all the white kids over there. Where the park is at the school, they want to close the county school. Aquí on First, Palm School.
Oh, Palm School.
There's a little park there. They didn't allow Mexican kids to swim there till the mid-1950s, and that's Palm School.
And Palm School was mostly Mexican children.
And most of the kids were Mexican, but they couldn't swim there. And so the struggles that people went through here in East Austin really are important for people to know about and for people to understand that are moving in, even our children and our grandchildren. Like they say, what we do today, we do in honor of all the generations that lived before us and the 7 generations that are going to come back after us. That's why we do this, because people need to know that they're moving into a beautiful. People didn't want to live in East Austin because it was supposedly a bunch of drug addicts, a bunch of violence. It was dirty. It was ugly. And what I like to say, then sometime in the mid-'80s or sooner, remember the redlining made a lot of the houses be dilapidated and where they couldn't be fixed. It was a plan to have those houses become dilapidated and a plan for those people not to be able to afford to fix their houses. So when they took the commercial zoning off, people couldn't afford to fix their houses. They were too far gone. So guess what? The predators, the realtor community, the predator community came in and bought those houses off real cheaply. And that's what started gentrification, what we know now as gentrification. And that didn't start 20 years ago. It started 30, 40, 50 years ago, because that is what the plan was. We are told those were the unintended consequences. There's no such thing as unintended consequences, not when it comes to city government. And I call it internal colonialism.
Or intended consequences.
Yeah, and intended consequences. I'm a little bit more progressive, I think, than some more people, so that's the terminology I use. And I tell people, this is nothing new. The first gentrifiers were the pilgrims that came off the Mayflower. They saw this beautiful land, Plymouth Rock. They stuck their flag in there and said, what a beautiful land. This is ours now, as they saw the natives standing on the shore looking at them. Not too long ago, somebody from West Austin looked across Interstate 35 and said, shit, what a beautiful land this is. It's ours now. Looking at us, Mexicans and blacks, on the other side. They ain't worth it. There ain't nobody. This is ours now. And so little by little, this is nothing more, nothing different than the first gentrifiers from Plymouth Rock to East Austin. And they're doing the same thing. They're moving us back, killing some of us, because many people, when people on Rainy Street, all of those houses, there was a Rainy Street area neighborhood association. Acronym was cool, RANA, which means frog. Mr. Pete Martinez, when they were knocking down the Juarez Lincoln Center, I interviewed him and I asked him, what do you want to say? And he says, this is just the beginning. He says, what they want to do is build condominiums. They want to build high apartments and buildings, and they're moving us out. He was west of Interstate 35. And he says, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've been moved 3 times already. I don't know what I'm going to do. And they moved him, and he moved, and about 6 months later or less, he died. So people have died that have been moved from here, and people are saying, well, hell, they're making a ton of money. They're selling their houses for $300,000, $400,000. Show me a place in Austin, Texas today that you can buy a house for $300,000 or less. Even this house that only costs $38,000 is worth close to $500,000 today. My children, my grandchildren, most of the young black and brown people in this community cannot afford to buy even my house, which is almost 40 years old, much less one of those.
And they live in communities like Pflugerville, Hutto, Manor.
So people are being moved
Kyle,
to the suburbs. And the city says, well, we want to build a tight, dense city because we don't want to expand to suburbia. Well, guess what? The tight city, inner city, the city policies are causing people to move. Then we're told, it's the current code that allows that. No, my position has always been, the city council has not met a city code that they will not give a variance for. And they give variances to them for almost everything. So if they follow the code, we would not have the massive gentrification that we're having right now. But they don't, they give variances. And so that's why people are being moved out. And we're being moved out further east, and then somebody else is gonna go to Cal, to Del Valle, to Manor, and they're gonna say, there's my flag. Isn't Manor and Bastrop and everything so beautiful? Let's go there now. And so before you know it, you know, there aren't going to be any people of color inside the city. This is, as somebody called it, this is going to be an imperial city. And so I think for me, what I want people to know when they look at this video is we agreed to have you all listen to our little story here, because we want people that in the future, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, city staff to look at it and say, and understand what was going on here for the last 100 years. One of the things that we have found, we've been very involved, we're always involved in the city with council members. We know them all individually, we know them personally, is that when city staff changes in the planning department, we may have a personal relationship with you for 10 years. When you leave, Joe Smith that shows up as a new um, employee in the planning department comes and knocks on the door and says, my name is Joe Smith, I'm the new planning representative for your area. I'm here to talk about what we're planning in the near future. I say, have you talked to people about the tank farm? Have you talked to people about the segregated schools? Have you talked to people about the segregated parks? Have you talked to people about no water, no street lights? Have you talked to the people about having the only hospital in East Austin bulldozed down? Oh no, well we spoke to your predecessor about that and they did a video about it. Oh, I don't know anything about it. Why don't you tell me about it? And you go,
Here we go again.
why is this little greenhorn sitting in my house wasting my time? We've done this before.
Many times.
Many times. So I'm hoping that this doesn't become just another thing that goes up in the shelf. Like many of our recommendations to the city council, that we tell them, this is what, we know what's happening, we know what needs to be done. We may not have the degrees, but we have a degree of knowledge that no matter how many degrees a person downtown has, will not and cannot understand unless they have lived it. If you haven't lived my life, and then you cannot pretend to understand that you know me. And so that is, for me, the most important thing that I want people to be able to look at this and say, this used to be a very bad neighborhood, and I agree, it was very bad, very polluted, and so forth. And because of those people's struggle and those people's sacrifices, and we have what we have today. I always say, I, Gilberto Rivera, stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, who, because of their struggles, I am here today. They fought and they struggled. My parents were sharecroppers. I remember my mom talking about having nothing but onions to eat, walking down the street when she was going to school during the Depression, and they'd find orange peels on the ground and pick them up and eat because of their struggles. And it was not all bad, because there was a lot of love, a lot of music, a lot of friendships, a lot of life going on that allows me, allows Jane, allows all of you, us here, to have the luxury of sitting in my backyard and having this conversation. And so that's, to me, is one of the most important things that I want. And again, going back about, and this may sound silly, but just to show how the segregation and how bad people were about East Austin. In the 1980s, 80s, there was not one pizza place in all of East Austin. It was either west of 35 or south of the river. You would call Pizza Hut, or one of the pizza places, and say, I'd like a large pepperoni and veggie and a large veggie pizza. They said, sure, no problem, sir. And I'd like it delivered. And what's your address? 1000 Glen Oaks Court. I'm sorry, we don't deliver there. Somebody else would say, I live on Garden Street or on Go Valley or whatever. They would tell you, but this is what I can do. We'll make the pizza. We'll meet you at the golf station on Interstate 35. And there you can give us the money and we'll give you the pizza. That's how bad people thought about East Austin, and how racist and the way that we've been treated. And that was only maybe 30 years ago. And we're talking about this going on for close to 100 years already. So when is it going to stop?
Well, and one of Gilbert's bosses, because he worked for the city for almost 30 years in the environmental conservation programs, one of his bosses, as recently as 20 years ago, said, "How can you stand to live in East Austin? Don't you get sick and tired of hearing gunshots every night?" Well, we've been here for almost 40 years. I've never heard one gunshot, not one. And I wanted to comment on something he was talking about earlier about gentrification. I mentioned before that East Austin was like a small town, and it was very pleasant and caring, and everybody seemed to be related or had gone to school together or something, and that I miss all of that has changed. And I have a term for what I'm calling the changes that have occurred, not just gentrification, but that the city's current policy towards increasing density in all of the city interstate, east of Interstate 35. The increasing density is not reducing the dispersion of the population out to the suburbs. It's just reducing the dispersion of white people out to the suburbs. And so I call that change the changing color of displacement and dispersion out to the suburbs. We aren't stopping it. It's just changing the color of it. It's people of color who are being moved out now. So it hasn't stopped it at all. And so the densification is not doing what the city planners say they intended, which is to reduce the harm to the environment caused by forcing people out to the suburbs. No. And when you say out to the suburbs, that's a misnomer too. Out to the rural areas is a more correct statement, because where a lot of people are moving, a lot of the times the places they're moving haven't yet been approved for residential life. And so things like what have happened in some of the developments in the Mustang Ridge area are happening all over Travis and Caldwell and Hayes County now, where developers build small little, cul-de-sacs and stuff with new housing, but they can't get hooked up to utilities because it hasn't been approved. So it's not really moving to the suburbs, which sounds like a nice place to live. It's moving out to underdeveloped areas.
And they're moving to places that are known in the valley and the Rio Grande Valley as colonias.
Yeah.
They're colonias here in the Travis County, where people are living subsistence living. They have no access to water. They have no access to anything, and so they live, unscrupulous developers selling property, but they don't provide any other services. So those are the kinds of places that people are having to move to, who used to have, like my parents when they had urban removal, used to have a house before. Now many of them are barely surviving. And I think one of the problems that, and we're not against development. People say, oh, y'all are just anti-growth, anti-development, we're not. We want to see more housing for working class families. Okay, so what I was going to say real quickly here is that we're not against development. We're not against housing. We are for housing that is affordable to working class people. Right now, the majority of houses that are being built for people that probably have an income of $90,000, $150,000 or more. Most working class families in East Austin make about $45,000 with a family of four, $45,000. We're looking for apartments, rentals units that they can afford. Most rental units right now are one bedrooms, at the most maybe two bedrooms. Where's the apartment for a family of four, a family of six? There aren't any being built.
And in a lot of the housing projects that are being approved, they will have, out of 100 units, they're only required to have 10 that are affordable. But as Gilbert pointed out, affordable for whom? Out of the 10 units that are affordable, only one will have more than 2 bedrooms. And so they're giving 1 out of 100 to a working class family. And the really sad thing is that most of the working class families haven't even got a clue that that unit's available, because it's not available widely. The knowledge of where these are is not widely available to anybody who really needs it.
And for those families that do get in, I've had a staffer say, well, do you really want a family of a 4-bedroom apartment, maybe 2 of them in a 100-unit complex that is going to be populated mostly by single or couples and students and all the partying and all the noises? We say, you know what, I'd rather have, no, I don't want 2, I want 10, I want 20. That way, that way you'll have that many people still living in the city. I think that that when it comes to the tank farm, it is one of just many examples that we have talked about today of what has gone on. We make recommendations to the city. We are 2 of the authors of the People's Plan, and you all may be aware of it. And none of it has been implemented, even though we got a lot of, oh, that's great, that's beautiful, we can see what we can do. But again, people need to understand that the tank farm was one of the most insidious things that the city allowed in East Austin, right on top of neighborhoods. People that we have talked to have said, well, people knew that the tanks were there, why did they move there? It's the same question that people ask. People knew that the freeway was there, why do they leave have houses right next to the freeway? Well, the houses were there before the freeway, the houses were there before the tank farm, the houses were there before the power plant. And so what I think is the most important message that we want to send is understand, listen to what we're saying, take it into consideration, use it as part of your future planning, whether it's watershed protection, whether it's the environmental department, whether it's any of the city departments. Use our experiences as examples of what not to do and what can be done for betterment. There's a lot of great things going on right now in East Austin, and I love a lot of them. We've got affordable housing going on off Jane Lane and Go Valley Park, where the Cesar Chavez Foundation is building affordable housing.
And Go Valley Park was just upgraded for the first
And
time
Go
in
Valley
something
Park
like
has been
50 years. New pool and
The
everything.
45-mile-an-hour speed limit in my backyard has gone down to 30. So these are good things. Austin Community College has come up, beautiful. We can now order pizzas, great. And so there's a lot of good things going on. We have doctors, we have nurses, we have dental facilities, etc. So now we're becoming part of the first world. And so we want to be treated as equals, have the same amenities that everybody has, and be able to live in our neighborhood. To have those same amenities that everybody has should not cost us our houses. To have the same amenities should not force us to move out. To have the same amenities should not be seen as negative effects on us, but positive effects. So the tank farm is just an example of how negative things can happen. And today is a positive thing, because the former tank farm, several of the companies own different pieces. We've got, ¿cómo se llama? The new building, that commercial building that were built next where the tank farm was.
Oh, Springdale General.
We now have Springdale General. We're getting another similar project coming up soon. That we now have Springdale General, and we have another project similar to it right next door coming up soon. We're having more apartment complexes being built, and they're more. Some of them have more affordable housing.
And the Housing Authority built apartments over in the area where it was cleaned up, safe for housing, where the tank farms used to be. So that has opened up housing for some of those working class families that we were talking about.
So we welcome new building a new development, new housing projects, new infill housing.
But we urge some sensitivity, some understanding of why people like us, the old timers, are angry. We are angry. We get angry when we start talking about these things because our lives have been a constant struggle against injustice that we see continuing. And so the anger comes from experience. And when you've had a lot of negative experiences, it's going to take a lot more positive experiences to wipe out those memories. And so I am hoping that this interview will help people to understand working class families have a right to live in Austin. If they have jobs in Austin, they should be able to live within a reasonable distance of their jobs so that they don't have to ride 20 miles twice a day in a rattle trap, which is all they can afford, to work as a janitor in a high-rise downtown. They shouldn't have to spend 4 hours a day on a train or a bus to get to a job cleaning the streets. There should be some sensitivity to the needs that the workers who keep things running downtown have, not just the tech workers who have the more, I don't know, glamorous image that everybody knows Austin for. For every tech worker, there are probably 4 or 5 working class people keeping things running so that they can do their job. And we're just urging that the city please start thinking about all of those people whenever deciding to make changes of any kind.
But that's a good ending. I think that we hope and pray that the next 100 years are much better for working class people, because the last 100 have been pretty bad. But one thing that encourages me is that no matter how bad it's been, many of us, the majority of us, have managed to persevere. We've managed to do what we have to do to survive, and we've provided for our children and for their children. Our children will provide for them because they've learned the same lessons that we did, that we have. And I think the future of Austin would be much better when people of all colors and all income levels can live together, and hopefully what we're doing today will be just one small little bit toward that goal.